I'm Brent Barnett on Brownfield Ag News, and today we're getting a weather and agricultural weather update from Brian Fuchs with the National Drought Mitigation Center. Brian, thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
Well, another cold morning, but hanging in there.
Yep, it's definitely been pretty cold here lately. We've had some conditions below zero, and that can be tough on producers, especially livestock farmers.
Yeah, especially this time of year, we start seeing some of that early calving taking place, and means that some of those livestock producers have had some late nights and long days just trying to find those new calves when they get born and get them into some shelter and some protection, and taking care of the mothers as well, because when we've had air temperatures the way they've been, it's just brutal for everyone, and it pans and animals and humans.
Will these bitter cold temperatures, like below zero and things like that, will they be getting out of the region soon?
Yeah, it does look like the cold weather that we all have seemed to feel this week, all the way down into the south even. Looks like that's going to push on out, through the weekend, starts getting into a warming pattern. And it looks like for the most part next week, we're definitely going to see some warmer conditions, especially through the western U.S. into the plains and Midwest. So quite the change from week to week we'll be seeing.
Can you give the listeners some background on the work you do when it comes to the U.S. Drought Monitor?
So yes, the National Drought Mitigation Center, where I am housed, is the home of the U.S. Drought Monitor that we create in a partnership with the U.S. Department of Agriculture as well as NOAA. And what I do, I'm a U.S. Drought Monitor author. I have been for over 20 years now. And so part of the work that I do is greatly associated with putting the map together during certain weeks of the year. We have a roster currently of 9 authors between the 3 agencies. And so we do a couple weeks at a time. We'll rotate to the next author, just because during those weeks that you do put the map together, there is so much going on. And we don't want to have any burnout of just continuously doing the map. And one thing that we do work with a lot in doing the map is with stakeholders and users around the country. We have worked with the scientific community as well, and we have over 400 people that work along with the lead author, such as myself, in any given week, putting that map together, getting local feedback, looking at the draft maps as they come out. And so there's a lot of data involved in this. A lot of different eyes are looking at these data, and then we try to come to a conclusion using the metrics associated with the drought monitor to put together a map that's really supposed to be an assessment of current conditions for that point in time.
Much of the region has snow on the ground currently from a system or two that came through in the last week or two. And we still hear reports that we're in a snow drought. Brian, can you talk about what that means? And is that a regular term that's used, snow drought?
So yeah, when we have finally picked up some snow in some of these regions, for the most part, a lot of these areas hadn't seen much snow this year. I think it was kind of an odd year that the further south you went into the southern portions of the Midwest and the plains, we've had areas that had a lot more snow than the northern portions. And that just was due to the storm track. And again, we've had some cold weather. So when you start looking up the numbers for the season for the entire winter, a lot of areas have been well below normal for as much snow as they typically would see. And that's where that idea of a snow drought comes from. Some areas are quite a bit below normal. And it is a term that we've been seeing used more and more. We tend to hear it more in some of the mountainous regions when the upper elevations don't get that snow, and they really rely on that for runoff and reservoir filling in the spring. So it's mostly associated with the West, but in years like this, we've definitely been seeing less snow, and people are taking note of it. And it really does impact some of the winter activities, especially in our more northern neighbors, where activities such as ice fishing or cross-country skiing or any of that really gets impacted when you don't have that snow.
You and I are talking here in late February, and before you know it, farmers will be out planting for this year's crop. Are there any concerns about precipitation deficits going into this growing season here?
Yeah, that's actually a good question to be looking at. That with the U.S. Drought Monitor map right now through much of the plains, northern plains especially, we do see a lot of drought. not as much in the Midwest or Southern Plains until you get into far areas of South Texas. So you would think that, conditions are not too bad through much of the, grain belt. But, one thing I actually ran across this week in doing the U.S. Drought Monitor map is I pulled up some longer term data. I was looking at data from that accumulated over the last 3, 4, and 5 years. And what I was seeing was over portions of central and eastern Nebraska into much of Iowa, a lot of central and eastern Kansas and parts of Missouri. There were some very long-term deficits that were standing out, meaning that some of these areas over the last 4 to 5 years have missed out on over 20 to 25 inches of precipitation. And the further east you go, that doesn't appear to be as problematic because they do have a wetter climate and they do get more precipitation. But definitely as you get into central and western Nebraska and western Kansas, those areas just don't pick up as much annual precipitation. So when you're saying they have missed out on 20 inches or more over the last 5 years, that's basically saying they've missed out on an entire year's worth of precipitation. So typically with agriculture, we're looking at, what are the immediate conditions, the short-term conditions? Is there moisture in the soil? Can I get the crop in the ground and will it have a good growing season? But what that longer-term deficit is telling me are some of these areas are pretty vulnerable right now, that if we do hit a dry patch, and we've had a pretty dry winter in some of these areas, if we continue that into spring, we could see some drought-related issues really start blossoming before you would typically anticipate them.
When we talk drought, we obviously think about, for farmers, the crop conditions, but livestock producers can also be impacted, right?
Oh, most definitely. When we start thinking about our livestock producers, they are really looking at, how did their pasture and grazing lands recover from the last production year before those animals were taken off summer pastures? Did they get some moisture? Is that moisture in the soil? So when it does warm up, are those cool season grasses, especially, are they going to really take off, or are they going to be stagnated by drought conditions? And so livestock producers are just as impacted as well, because they either have to accommodate the number of animals that they hold on their pastures, or they got to start reducing those herds, or they got to go on the open market and start buying feed if they don't have a surplus already stockpiled, and that means money for them. All those activities mean either a loss of money or an expenditure of money. And so livestock producers are definitely impacted by drought as well.
Always great insights here, Brian. Before we go, do you have kind of an outlook here on what we're expected to see on conditions, whether it be short or long-term, kind of things you're keeping an eye on at this time?
Yeah, so, we mentioned earlier in the call that we've just been on this kind of roller coaster of weather this winter. We've had some mild portions. We've had some pretty extreme, and I think that's really going to continue. And as we get into spring, we typically see this more and more, that we can get those late snow events. So we could easily be 70 degrees as well. So I think that roller coaster is going to continue. When we start looking at the longer drought outlook, we just had a new seasonal drought outlook come out yesterday that takes us through the end of May, and not too encouraging for much of the plains on that aspect. It looks like the drought that we are seeing in the plains is going to persist through the end of May, and probably even seeing some further drought developing in more of Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas that we currently are not seeing drought in. It does look like the further east you go, that some of the drought that we're seeing in the upper Midwest and Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, we could see some improvement, but definitely through the plain states and into the West, drought's definitely going to be a topic that we're going to be talking about going forward.
Well, I'm sure we'll have a lot of updates this year, and looking forward to more of the drought monitor, and really appreciate your work there on that front. Brian, we'll stay in touch throughout the growing season and see if we can maybe have you back on and do some more updates. All right.
That sounds good, Brent. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us as always. Again, that's Brian Fuchs with the National Drought Mitigation Center right here on Brownfield Ag News. I'm Brent Barnett.